Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the SCV Chambers Part 1 of our Emotional Intelligence webinar series. Thanks for all joining. We're going to begin in just a minute. Just a quick housekeeping rule I'd like to go over. In your control panel to the right on the screen, you'll see a questions box. Throughout the webinar, we will be utilizing the box, so please make sure you have access to it. And once again, we'll be starting in just a minute. I want to thank you all again for joining part 1 of the SCV Chambers Emotional Intelligence webinar series, presented by the Chambers Focus SCV program in partnership with College of the Canyons and the Employee Training Institute. My name is Peter Warder with the Chamber, and I'll be hosting today's webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to make a quick announcement. In partnership with the Santa Clarita Valley Economic Development Corporation, we're pleased to announce a new webinar series titled Scaling Up Back to Business. The series will begin next week, and we're scheduled for Wednesday, May 6th at 10 a.m. and Friday, May 8th at 10 a.m. The webinar series will continue thereafter twice a week and consist of business-to-business panels and business-to-consumer panels discussing a post-COVID-19 business world. You can find all the information and register for that event on our website, scvchamber.com, under the Events tab. As we begin our program today, I'd like to first thank our presenter, Dr. Barbara Sweet, for helping put together this important webinar. Dr. Sweet is the president and CEO of the Learning Transfer Institute. She's an accomplished HR speaker and author of The Positive Transfer of Learning from Training to Changed Behaviors at the Job. Dr. Sweet has more than 20 years of business executive experience working with all levels of employees in the design, development, coaching, and execution of business strategies and initiatives. Today's webinar will provide you with a proven framework for developing virtual leadership competencies and strengthening a virtual work culture of employee engagement, cooperation, and productivity. Upon completion of the webinar, you'll be able to identify the top 2 management challenges that interfere with virtual leadership, describe strategies that cultivate your virtual leadership presence, facilitate virtual coaching conversations that help build trusting relationships and inspire greater employee engagement and productivity, and create win-to-win agreements for cooperative, inclusive, and collaborative virtual work culture practices. With that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Barbara Sweet. Dr. Sweet, it's all yours.
Oh, great. Thank you, Peter, for the warm welcome. And I appreciate all of you for attending this seminar. It may be a little different than some of the webinars that you have experienced over the last couple weeks. This will be a highly engaging learning experience for you. Because what I found through my research is the more actively involved you can be in the learning process, the more of the application back at the job. So Peter had mentioned there's a feature that we'll be using, and it's called the question, where you would normally enter a question. At a certain point, I'll let you know, can you go ahead and provide some answers? And we'll also use a polling feature. So that will let us know. Peter will be managing that to see how you feel about a certain topic regarding emotional intelligence versus another. Also know that as I go throughout this webinar, it is at a macro level, and I will give you some resources as we go along. Please note that after the webinar, there will be a written resource guideline, so don't feel that you have to take detailed notes. I really want you to be fully engaged. So with that, speaking of engagement, I like to do our first poll to find out from you, and this is on average. How long do you think people actively listen? And Peter, if you can go ahead and launch that poll, we'll see what the participants have to say about that.
Sure, thanks, Dr. Sweet. So again, everybody, your screen is about to change. You will receive a poll now on the screen. Please take a few seconds to answer it, and then we'll move on forward. We'll go ahead and close it in just a couple seconds. So if you haven't answered, please take a second to do so. Perfect. All right, Dr. Sweet, I can share the results for you now if you'd like.
Oh, wonderful. And Peter, should I be seeing it on my screen at this point?
Yeah, were you able to see them or no?
I was not.
Let me try it one more time. If you don't see it, I can go ahead and read it off for you. So 0% voted for 17 minutes, 48% voted for 1 minute, 26% voted for 17 seconds, and 26% voted for 7 minutes.
Great. So good key points. The winner of this is those that said 17 seconds. And if you can imagine, we are in an age of distraction. And I can probably guess that some of you from the start of this webinar may have been, your thought process may have been in and out of this seminar, which is perfectly normal. Why is this important to know as a leader? Is that if we want our employees to be engaged, we need to make sure that they fully participate in this type of training. Distraction, just to give you some feedback, we talk at a rate about 225 words a minute, yet we listen at 500 words a minute. So that means our minds are filling in the gap of that 275 words. And so what I try to do in my training and in my staff meetings is to make sure that employees, participants are engaged. So for the webinar objectives, we're going to identify 2 top management mistakes, the strategies for having that present facilitating and coaching conversation, as well as win-win agreements. So once again, I would like your engagement in this webinar. I'd like to pose to you, what do you think? You're the one with the greatest wisdom, the one that's closest to the situation. What do you think are the top 2 mistakes that interfere with effective leadership? So you'll go ahead and use your question feature to write down your 2 answers. Peter will go ahead and review them. It is anonymous, so if you're not sure, that's okay. It won't come back to you specifically, and then Peter will read some of those answers for a share.
Thanks, Dr. Sweet. So yeah, as Dr. Sweet mentioned, please use the questions box right now to answer the question that you see on your screen. We'll give you guys a couple minutes to do so. As she mentioned, it is anonymous. I'll just go through and pick a couple answers. No names will be said, and no one else can see your answer except myself. So if you just take a minute to do so, and then we'll continue on. We'll take about 15 more seconds. All right, thanks everybody for that. So Dr. Sweet, one of the biggest and one of the most common answers that came in that a lot of people answered was not listening. A couple of the other ones was complaining about your job or boss or life to subordinates, micromanaging, procrastination, arrogance, ineffective communication, putting profits over people, and unclear vision.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your participation. And some of the answers are definitely the talking points of today. We will be discussing micromanaging, how to more effectively, and it talks about autonomy, is allowing people the freedom to choose how they want to do. If you can imagine, for those of us that drive with our family and we're driving our car and we have backseat drivers, right? They're going to tell us how to drive. And as you can remember, that's a very frustrating experience. So how do we not micromanage? So that is one of the mistakes that we do, is that we do not give the autonomy. And then what was also mentioned is that we have to take care of ourselves first. We have to manage ourselves. So let me go through the two main themes that were illustrated through your own words. So the first one is, mistake one is that the leaders have not managed themselves first. And so if you think about a flight attendant, what's usually told at the very beginning for safety is you need to put on your oxygen mask first before putting the oxygen mask on others. So you need to have oxygen to help people. So physiologically, we would say the oxygen mask is, according to Dr. Bradbury, who's an expert in emotional intelligence, are three things that we do have control over. And this is physiologically would be control over our sleep, control over how we manage our stress, and control over our caffeine intake. He found that when things are not in balance, and maybe you can appreciate this, the conversation doesn't go as well. If you've known when you're not fully had sleep, your conversation, you may have less patience, you may get more irritable. So physiologically, that oxygen mask is to take care of yourself that way. Another way of looking at that oxygen mask is what you had mentioned in some of your answers, is how can I provide that oxygen mask for my employees? And I want to say that it's really the Thrive leadership of how can I thrive, especially in this environment. The first one is take opportunities for self-development. You all have come here for the webinar for that self-development, and so that's courageous for you to want to learn something more. When I work with different companies, one thing that we may do is come up with different assessments. When we go over communication training, we work with a book called People Styles at Work, and we learn about different communication styles. And so it's knowing about yourself. For example, I'm a driver, and so I tend to get to the point. What I have to learn about is not everyone else is a driver. So when I have an amiable person who likes to kind of have more relationship, I need to remind myself when meeting with that employee that I need to do small talk first. It's not something I do naturally, and over time I am, but that is something that I learn. The assessment, another one is Clip Strengths. It's 34. It's a gallup.com. And again, all these resources we'll provide to you. And you can find out what your 5 strengths are, or you can go to the more advanced survey or assessment that has 34. And right now, another assessment that's currently free online is from Marcus Buckingham, who has authored many books on strength-based leadership. And his assessment is called Standout Assessment. So if you even Google that, Marcus Buckingham Standout Assessment, he worked with ADP and he's offering that for free right now. And what's nice about that is you'll get, after completing it, a 14-page documentation about your assessment. So I'm an executive coach. I work with different supervisors. So a lot we start with the assessments, and they're clues, not absolute. So we're not trying to put you in a box, but it is helpful to know a little bit more about you. Next is hold yourself accountable. That's something I invite my staff, my students, my participants, is if I make a commitment that you can hold me accountable. I actually invite you to do that. And in our series next week, we're going to do a deeper dive into team building and how important peer accountability is. The other part is recognize how your behavior affects other people. And sometimes there is a disconnect when I do executive coaching and there's a self-assessment of how you think you're doing as a leader versus how your employees or your boss. Sometimes there's a disconnect. One might be a positive gap where I don't think of myself as highly as my staff thinks of me. And so maybe I have a little bit of perfectionism in me. Maybe I don't realize that I'm doing just fine. And so I should continue with that. Then we have what's called a negative gap, and that is that leader thinks that they're doing a great job when their staff doesn't think so. Now, that conversation in coaching can be a little bit more challenging where we have to kind of break down the defensives, but that's something to think about. So what could you do? You could do something as formal as what I work with companies in, and that's a 360 assessment. And the other could be as informal as after having a staff meeting, how did things go? What went well in my staff meeting? What didn't? And if there's truly trust there and you're inviting them and you accept their answer without coming to any defense, it proves very successful. The other is, and it was mentioned here in some of your answers, is to view changes with a proactive lens. This comes from Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Effective People, and that is focusing on what I do have control over. And there's 3 things I have control over: what I think, what I say, and what I do. And it was mentioned here in one of your answers of be careful what I say, because words matter. And then last is enter situations with an open mind. And it's a little bit different than what I often hear supervisors say, which is just to know my door is always open. That is not enough for employees. It's great that your door is open and I can come in to talk to you. And if it's about a mistake I made or it's about a customer complaint, you have what I call an open mind policy. And that's at a much different level. And that is that when I come to you, you first seek to understand the situation without rushing to judgment. I do that a lot. I do sexual harassment prevention training and investigation. And regardless of the parties involved, I make sure that I look at each party that I'm investigating with an open mind, without any preconceived conclusion. The other mistake that happens is that leaders don't allow people the autonomy to manage themselves against shared expectations. It goes back to someone as a backseat driver is telling you how to do things. In this virtual environment, it becomes even more so, realizing that you have to manage people short of having a webcam in front of them or where they are. There are certain things that you don't have access to. So how can I sure that things are happening according to plan? I call it the map for shared expectations. The first thing you want to do is make sure you have measured outcomes. What gets measured gets managed. The first one is making sure that you have job standards, and this is different than job duties. Job duties are usually listed in the job description as what needs to be done, whereas really need to think about and have written and agreed upon of what job standards look like, which is how well I need to do the job. I'll give you a brief example of the difference. If I have a receptionist that answers phone, that would be the job duty. How well this person needs to do the job is a job standard, such as you need to do it within 3 rings, answer the phone, and you need to have a service greeting of our company and your name, as well as a service statement of how can I be of assistance. And that way, the clearer you are as a leader, the more that you can hold them accountable to that shared expectation. The other is a SMART goal. And if you're not familiar with that, it's specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. And goals answers what needs to be done, but not how to do it. So when I work with clients, we get together with a goal, and then I collaborate with them. How do you think we should get there? to illustrate this in a non-work related manner is a topic that we might be more interesting now that we're closer to our refrigerators at home, is lose weight. So that in itself is not a SMART goal. How we would make it SMART is to actually say lose 15 pounds, or maybe I decide lose inches. So I decide on what the metrics will be. And I make sure there's a date, and I call it the finish line, not the starting line. And that is a month, a day, and a year. We know, as when it comes to diets, if we say we'll start tomorrow, it may not happen. But with a finish line, an end date, we hold ourselves accountable to that. Now, if I were a health coach and working with them on that goal, I would talk with that person or that employee of how do you think it would be best work to get there. So say if it's going to the same example of lose weight with a diet, I might say, well, what foods do you like? What type of exercise? Do you see yourself at a gym, or do you see more of walking the dog? And then with that way, they have the autonomy to work out an action plan. Next is to be adaptable. And what I would say, we're all going through uncertainty. This may be new for a virtual environment. And I would caution you to focus on what matters. I'll give you an example for me with technology. Years ago, when laptops were first introduced to the classroom, I had the position of no laptops in the training. And that was my position. But what was my issue underneath that? And that was I wanted engagement. So my position has evolved over the years. And when I have training now, I do have, this is when it was on site, that managers would come in, they have all their laptops open. And when I said training's ready to start, I would say about 80% closes their laptops, maybe even 90%. But there were still few that were planning to do their work during the training. And so I had to come up with something. How can I, without saying close your laptops, that they would want to close their laptops? So what I did was I made sure early on that they were involved. I set them up in teams. And what we'll talk about next week, the really good way is peer accountability. That sometimes is more effective than leadership accountability. And that is when they were set up in teams, it was awkward for them to be working on something when their team members were asking them for their assistance. And then finally, if you've not heard of this term, it's called plus delta. So as you're getting situated in this new normal of a work environment, it's something you can do real informally, but proven quite effective with your staff. It's just say, you know, during this week, we had you set up at home. What went well? What should we continue doing? And then what could be done even better? And how can I support you on that? And so that might be under consideration. Here, what we're talking about with the emotional intelligence model are basically 4 areas. Not only Dr. Bradbury, there's Daniel Goldman. He's also written some books. And there are 4 main ones: self-awareness that we'll talk about, and then self-management. So that's that first mistake of how do we manage ourselves. And then the other 2 are social awareness and social management. So I hope to leave you with some strategies. And so here, this is our next poll that if you can participate in, and I'm going to ask you to go back for a couple weeks ago when you first heard about the California stay-at-home order, and what were the emotions that were involved. So what was your primary emotion when you first heard about the stay-at-home order? Now, we do have some limitations with the GoToWebinar. We can list about 5. Just know there's about 588 emotions that we could express. So if you could kindly just choose maybe one of the 5 that most resonated, not now how you feel, but when you first heard about the stay-at-home order. So Peter, you can go ahead and set the poll up so they can answer. That would be great.
Thanks, Dr. Sweet. So I'll go ahead and launch the poll now. I believe in the first poll there was a little bit of confusion. So if you make sure that the webinar is at the front of your screen will change in a second, and you should have a few answers that come up. And we'll go ahead and take a few seconds to respond. I'll go ahead and give it another couple seconds if you haven't had a chance. Okay, we'll go ahead and close the poll now. Dr. Sweet, I'll go ahead and share the responses with you. 0% said happy, 56% were surprised, 20% said secure, 20% said sad, and 4% said angry.
Yeah, so the emotions is something that serves a function. So when we talk about emotional intelligence, we're not in any way saying to suppress these emotions. These are real emotions, complicated emotions. How it serves a purpose, though it was a smaller percentage, anger, a lot of times, is the underlying function is we feel an injustice, not being fair. And there's times in our lives when we get angry about it. We make changes in policies and in procedures and things like that. So sometimes it is necessary. Another one that was mentioned is they actually felt secured. And so it's a different way of looking at the same situation. Somebody saying we have to stay at home, and then another might look, we're secured at home. It may be a good thing. So recognize that emotions really serve a purpose, and you have to step back and evaluate, is this helping or hurting my overall purpose? Sometimes when we hear ourselves say, oh, my emotions got the best of me, we call that emotional hijacking, where it is disruptive to what we need to do. So there you want to be mindful of. Also, when we're talking about emotion, particularly in what is happening with us, grief is not always an emotion that we expect to feel at work. But if you can appreciate, we all are experiencing some kind of loss of what we were able to do, say, in February versus what we can do now. And that's the grief. That's a grieving process that we go through. And so here, I'd like you to go ahead. You're doing a wonderful job, so I do appreciate, is what type of loss are you feeling because of this stay-at-home order? Something that could have happened back in February with freedom to do so, and now you can't. Where do you feel that loss? If you can go ahead in your question feature and write that down.
So once again, for this one, we'll use the question feature box. Go ahead and take a few minutes to just go ahead and respond. Again, it's completely anonymous, and then we'll share a few answers. We'll take about 15 seconds. All right, Dr. Sweet, I'll go ahead and share a few of the answers with you. We've got control, not being able to roam freely at shops and restaurants, business and community loss, loss of activities, community events, shared experiences, feelings of being non-essential and or inadequate, loss of vacation and traveling, loss of my freedom and control.
Yeah, and these are, very strong feelings about loss, and we should honor and realize that we're going through something like that. And if you're going through that, that's why I like you to be engaged and kind of put yourself in that situation, is your staff is also going through very similar ones. Here's a poll. So I said, what happened back then, when you first started out? I'd like to know, now it's been about almost a month, how have your emotions changed over the past month? So Peter's going to go ahead and launch a poll, and we're going to see if there's been any change and in what direction.
So the polls, it's been launched, and I apologize. I know a couple of you are still having some issues. What I'll go ahead is I'll read the answers off. If you want to go ahead, if you don't see the poll, if you want to send your answers in the question box, we'll go ahead and work with that as well. So once again, in case you don't see it, it says, how have your emotions changed over the past month? And the answers are more positive, more negative, some positive and some negative, or remain the same. And we'll take a few seconds to answer that. All right, we'll go ahead and close the poll. All right, Dr. Sweet, here are the results. We've got 13% said more positive, 8% said more negative, 67% said some positive and some negative, and 13% said remain the same.
Sure. So what a majority of you are experiencing is almost what I call a roller coaster, where we have some things that we're getting situated with, that this is our new normal, and others we're starting to settle in like, this is for real. We are not moving back anytime soon. And so there is a model, the Kubler-Ross model, that actually first started as a grieving process if you've lost a loved one. And they found that this model actually goes real well in the business world with a change that is introduced at your workplace and with employees. So if you look at the slide, I want to first introduce just somehow the graphics is, you'll see on the y-axis, you'll see commitment and competencies. So that's the level of engagement from your employee or yourself. And then on the x-axis is time and what changes over time. So I'll start with the first phase, and you'll see at the very top towards the left, it says endings. And so when I mentioned about grief and loss, there is a loss to what we know back in February of how our life was. Now, it could be a temporary loss, and we could gain this back, but right now it is a loss. And so what sets in is fear. And so what you see initially, it's shock that, oh, I thought it was somewhere in a different state or abroad, and it's actually here in Los Angeles. It's a shock. The second might be a denial, and that is a defense mechanism that comes into play. And I had that a little bit when things happen. One client had changed their request as a result of it, and I thought, oh, it's isolated. It's just going to be something individual. Then it goes to acceptance, where I realize this is happening for real, and accepting the fact that things will change or has changed. Now, this is not linear. I may not go through all of this, just like you in your polling. Some remained the same. It was more of a flat line. With others, it became where positive and then negative. Now, for some, they may get angry at that acceptance that, oh, this is frustrating. The other response might be a depression, and that means that they can't see a way out of it. And they're focused on what they can't do rather than what can be done or possibilities. So if you see at the bottom, there's an arrow. This is where you come in as their supervisor, and that is really to have clarity with them in communication. And be mindful in a virtual environment, just writing words down and sending it to them, it's lost in translation. When something as important as this, whenever you have the opportunity, I call it, instead of having a monologue where it's one way, written communication is to have a dialogue, which involves two, and really get a sense of what they might be going through. And that requires empathy on our part. Now, oftentimes when asked, well, what is empathy? You'll hear the phrase, you put yourself in someone else's shoes. But in order to do that, guess what you have to do? You have to take off your own shoes. And that's putting aside your feelings, your beliefs about how I should react to this. You may be just fine in some of the percentages of the poll. It was just very linear. But for others, it is that roller coaster, and try to understand a point where they might be coming from. Now, if you do differ with the approach, another way of looking at it, if you're not feeling depressed by it, but your staff is, maybe reflect back a time in your life where you had perhaps that kind of moment where you felt like you couldn't get out of it. That's what's meant by empathy, is there may have been times in your life where you can relate to that. And then after time has gone on, there's what's called a transition period, and you will start seeing your employees starting to dip their toe into a new process. They may have been resistant at first, but now they're starting to explore. And so what's required on your part, as noted on the bottom, is how you can influence them. I'll give you two examples of how, when I've went online and maybe a platform I wasn't used to, of how people I work with really helped. John Milburn, who is the director of College of the Canyons, we had the first online webinar, and he did the idea of, I'm going to be in the class with you. And we had a pre-meeting, and he said, Barbara, we're all learning this. Don't worry about not getting it right. It's okay. And can you imagine me as a perfectionist that really was kind of building things up of how things should be? He just took that weight off of my shoulders that I put on myself. And also, you know, shout out to Peter, because he also helped me in making sure, okay, here's how we can do a poll, or here's an adjustment. So he helped influence my feeling comfortable in that process. So think about how you can, similar to Peter or John, is how can you offer that support and help when people are really unsure, they're out of their comfort zone. And with that generally will be the decision to kind of, okay, we're moving forward, we're following along. And then hopefully when we get over time, so it doesn't happen usually overnight, is a new beginning where we really can collaborate. And then here an ABC model is really used for kind of understanding where emotions come from. If you look at an emotion, there's usually some areas before that time when it has occurred. And so usually if you look at number one, it's an activating event. It's a triggering event. Something has happened. And then number two, it says belief or thought. That's where you have a choice and you get to choose what you're thinking about it. Now, usually it's in context of our upbringings or past experiences. And realize we all have our own filters of how we view the world. We view the world not as it is, but as we are. And so when we look at something, it's through the lens of our own experience. So if you look here at the example, we have a stay-at-home order. And if I'm in that mindset of can't, and I really feel for these high school seniors, is they can't attend their high school prom. And so they're frustrated. So if I were to have a high school child at home, I might spend some time empathizing with them and trying to kind of understand and just listen and reflect back of how that must be frustrating. Now here at a stay-at-home order, in order to move forward with that in a more productive way, is what can I do if we can't have the traditional prom? And I don't know if any of you are familiar with, it's John Krasinski from The Office, an actor. He has this thing online called Some Good News. And so I think it was last Friday or the Friday before, he sent out an invitation to all high school seniors and invited them to a virtual prom. And there was Billie Eilish, there was Jonas Brothers, there was Chance the Rapper, and they got dressed up in their gowns and their tux, and they danced the night away. And so you can see by changing a mindset, you might change the outcome of a consequence where they're actually excited about it. Here's a quote that I think really puts into perspective for me of how to manage through these unexpected things in our lives. Between stimulus and response, there is space. In that space is our power to choose our response. It is a choice. Sometimes it doesn't feel that way, but it truly is. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. And the person that authored that was Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor. And he's also author of Search of Meaning. So he was trying to make meaning in his situation. And I'm trying to do that too. How I'm getting through it personally is I advance myself 18 months from now and try to look back and did I grow from this experience? Did I do that more of what I can do? And the other more important reason of how I get through this is I have a 9-year-old beautiful daughter, Savannah, and I want her later in life to look back at 2020 and remember some really fun memories during this time of how mommy and daddy became her classmates and how we did the fun activities that she was used to in school. So here, my response is my choice. And Stephen Covey, he talks a lot about that language and reactive of I can. And so maybe asking yourself as we're in the work environment and we focus on what we can't do as a result of what's happening in the restrictions is what can we do? Because the more that we focus on that, our circle of influence really grows. So I wanted you to provide an example of where you're in that mode of can do. Maybe something you're particularly proud of during this time that even surprised you, or something as minor as, well, I get to be in my pajamas right now during this webinar. It's something positive that's coming from it. So go ahead and put what you can do as a result of something that was beyond your control. So if we can go ahead and use your question feature.
Thanks, Dr. Sweet. Yeah, this one, just use the question feature. It won't be a poll on your screen, and go ahead and submit the answers, and we'll take a minute or so. Take about 15 more seconds. All right, Dr. Sweet, I'll go ahead and run through some of the answers for you. We've got learn a new skill, stick to my exercise and take a walk every day and stay fit, improve my approach to doing business and improving relationships, staying connected with others personally and professionally. I can work towards continuing service in a different manner for clients and adapting to needs, can still do our jobs well virtually, develop programs to engage staff virtually, makes me creative and able to grow with staff. Someone said cook, household chores, gardening, more reading and less TV.
Wow, such can-do people. I love being a part of this group. And the staff's looking for you to be that beacon, to be that one that's inspirational. And in Stephen Covey's book, one of the habits is how are you going to leave a legacy? How are you going to make a difference in someone else's life? And I think you're really at a great place where you're doing that. You're creating a legacy, sounds like for your staff, but also for your family. So great job, everyone. One thing I wanted to tell you of how we use the ABC model in a different capacity than the virus, I know that's front and center of what we've been talking about, is also when we went back to self-manage of people, if you remember, I said has a negative gap where they don't realize how they're coming across to others. So you have someone, employee arrives late to your meeting, and there's a thought from a supervisor of how rude, and from that thought generates a feeling of anger, that there's been an injustice, right? That's the reason behind an anger response. If we look at it, different lens, employee arrives late to your meeting and thinking it happens. The consequence is curious. It doesn't mean that that's okay that they do that, but I don't know enough about it. So I also take the stance of what is it happens, and I'm a little curious. My main point of when they arrive late to a training is how can I get them engaged quickly? That is my main concern. Not so much of why they're late, but how can I get them engaged? And then afterwards, usually it's the employee or the participant that will say on the sidebar, hey, you know, this happened, okay? And then which response do you think that your employee would like of you? If you think about your people that have inspired you in life, your best supervisors, usually they came with that open-mindedness that we talked about before, of keeping an open mind until we find out further. It's that seek to understand that Stephen Covey often recommends. So here in social awareness, what should we do when we do feel that energy of anger or something like that? The best strategy that I have is you hit the pause button. And what that means, William Ury does this a lot with negotiation. He's the author of Getting to Yes, Getting Past No, is you go to the balcony. And that might mean stepping away from the computer, hitting it as a save as draft, but you want what Viktor Frankl talked about was space. Another way is to have coachable moments. I'll talk about a situation that just happened recently where I got stuck in a situation. And so I called my bosses over at the College of the Canyon. I called Justin Wallace, one of my bosses, and I said, Justin, I need some help. I'm seeing it. I need a different lens. And he's like, and I said, can you put John on the phone? He's like, sure. So John Milburn got on the phone as well. And they gave me a different perspective. They gave me fresh eyes of how to look at that situation. And from that conversation, I was able to move forward. And it was because of their approachability, their willingness to help that really made that happen. And it also required me to be a little bit vulnerable. Those are my bosses. And I said, you know what? I'm stuck here. Can you help? The other is encourage a 360 feedback, whether formally or just ask your staff, what can I improve upon? What am I doing well? And then also listen actively and reflectively. And that means that when we're listening, we can't be talking. So we listen with the intent to understand, not for the intent to reply. And that's hard. I've sat in on coaching sessions, and that's sometimes hard. And so allow the person that you're listening to, your staff, to have the mic, to have their airtime, and try best not to interrupt, not to equate their experience with your experience and then make it a promotional opportunity for you to talk about yourself. Is really be in the moment for them. And then place yourself in their shoes by taking off your own. And then the win-win agreement that we have that works pretty well also when I teach negotiation is separate issues from position. So if you remember, my position is no laptops, but what was under the iceberg? What the tip of the iceberg is that, but what issues? And it really was engagement. So when you look with your staff and you see an issue, maybe of they don't have their video screen on in our Zoom meeting, well, what matters? And so why does it matter? And it might be because of engagement. So you might have a sidebar, and is that the only way they can engage? I'm engaging with you, but I can't see you. So try to really separate what's underneath of what you want. And when you do that, you open up so many different options and saying, I need you to be engaging. So maybe staff, tell me how we can make that happen. There's some that feel very uncomfortable in front of a video screen, and we have to be mindful of that. As long as they're participating, that's what counts. Also to have standards, so we'll talk a lot about that in next week's class in team building, of setting a team charter, setting up rules that we all kind of put into effect. And then we hold each other accountable to that. And that's the last part of accountability. If you get this right and you work through it, it goes back to mistake number 2, that I can have people hold themselves accountable to those shared expectations. And one thing to leave you with as a quote of what we talked about today is, I am not a product of my circumstances, I am a product of my decisions. And with that, I'll turn it over to Peter.
Thanks so much for that, Dr. Barbara Sweet. So thanks, everybody. I just want to go ahead. I know this was a bit of a more interactive webinar than as we've had previously, which, we had a great amount of participation. So thank you all for that. If anybody does have questions, please feel free to send them in. We'll give it a couple minutes to see if anyone does. In the meantime, Dr. Sweet, do you kind of want to give a bit of a teaser about part 2 of our emotional intelligence webinar?
Absolutely. So here we're going to focus more on the teams and how they're going to work together. And so what we look at are things like trust issues, accountability, and how do we work and overcome conflict, and how we can work together for the common goal.
Perfect. So I'm getting a lot of feedback, no questions, but a lot of feedback about how people have loved this, and it's been an amazing presentation. So thank you for that. Dr. Sweet, just so I'm not mistaken, after our second series, you will be able to go ahead and send out a resource sheet for everyone that, or to me, that I can mail out to all attendees, correct?
Absolutely. So I know off the top of my head, I quote authors and resources, but I want you to have that available tool. So for those of you that really do want to have that assessment or to understand more, and feel free, my contact information will be on there if you have any further questions. I know the chamber does and college does, but we really want to be there to help you. That's our main concern.
Perfect. So we'll get that all over to you. We do hope you join us for the second session, but we will get that over to everyone who has registered after our second session. So just give us a bit of time. Once we complete the full webinar series, we'll go ahead and do that. For those of you who haven't registered, it is a week from today. So that is Thursday, May 7th, same time, 11 a.m. But with that, I'd like to thank Dr. Barbara Sweet, COC and the Employee Training Institute once again for this valuable information. And thank you all who were able to join us. If we didn't get to any of your questions or something does pop up, please feel free to email hello@scvchamber.com. I'll get the information over to Dr. Sweet and we'll try to get you the answer as soon as we can. Once again, part 2 is next week, same time, 11 a.m. The registration is on our website, scvchamber.com. Thank you again. Please be safe, be healthy, and don't hesitate to reach out and let us know how we can help you. Thank you all, and thanks again, Dr. Sweet.
You're welcome. Thank you.